started something new last Wednesday. All right. We were in Abraham so long, I think everybody's forgotten, right? No, Nehemiah. Okay, Nehemiah. Let's turn to chapter 2. We do remember how the book started last week. We gave the background to the story, and that entailed how Jerusalem had fallen. The city had been destroyed, and after the captivity, though a bunch of the Jews had returned home and they had rebuilt the temple, the walls of the city were still destroyed. Remember, we talked about what that meant, right? A city that doesn't have any walls doesn't have any defense. A city that doesn't have any defense is prone to worry, to stress, to fear, to invite trouble. And that bothered Nehemiah. When he sent word to check on them, how are they doing? You know, the word came back that the walls were still destroyed. The people were a reproach. And so he wept, and this bothered Nehemiah, and he began to pray to God. And he remembered God's promise. He remembered that God had said that, yes, if the people are disobedient, I will send them away. I will send them into captivity. And yet in the next breath, he calls on God to remember the promise that Lord, you said when the people would obey, when they would be faithful, that you'd bring them back. Lord, that you would have them to dwell in safety, that you would bless. And he actually calls himself to part of that. Lord, that I'm ready. I want to be obedient. I want to be faithful. And he calls on God to remember his promise of blessing to the faithful. And chapter 1 ended with him asking God in verse number 11 to give him prosperity. Prosper, I pray thee, thy servant this day. Whatever Nehemiah had in his mind to do, we haven't been told what it is yet, but whatever had been on his mind, he's praying, he's spending this time praying that God would give him success. Okay? And if we're ever going to have success, any project or plans that we have, we know that we have to pray for that. We have to pray and trust that God will give us that success. Let's look at chapter 2 tonight. And first of all, let's look at Nehemiah and the king. Nehemiah and the king. It says, it came to pass in the month Nisan, the 12th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him. And I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now, several months had passed by. Okay, chapter 2 does not begin the moment that chapter 1 ends. In fact, in chapter 1, we are told that it's the month Chislew. And then you come down here in chapter 2, and it's the month Nisan. Probably about 4 months have passed since Nehemiah had inquired and found out the truth about Jerusalem and wept and began praying to the Lord to give him success and to give him prosperity. Chapter 2 opens up 4 months after the events of chapter 1. But Nehemiah continued to do his job. But it was apparent that something was bothering him. Look here in chapter 2, verse 1. I took up wine, gave it to the king. We know that was his job. Chapter 1 told us he was the king's cupbearer. Now I had not been before time sad in his presence. So though Nehemiah had been bothered, and though he had been praying and praying hard according to chapter 1 about this subject, thus far he hasn't let on that anything's wrong. He just continues to go to work each day. He continues to stand in the king's presence as his cupbearer, as a trusted advisor, as a royal officer, as a servant in the royal court and house. And he just continues to go about his day job. Up to this point, he hadn't really shown it. But as time goes on, Nehemiah can't continue to hide it. Now, he says, I had not been before time sad in his presence. Wherefore said the king said unto me, why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. The king could tell that something was wrong. Now the king could tell that it wasn't just a normal sickness, right? I mean, he's not sick. Now there's something wrong with Nehemiah, but he doesn't look sick. He doesn't look like a headache. He doesn't have the flu. But there's something wrong, and he could tell. You know, that kind of leads us to believe that Nehemiah had always kept somewhat of a pleasant countenance about himself, right? This verse proves that people notice your countenance, okay? That is an encouragement to us to do what we can to have a pleasant countenance. Don't be a grump as you walk through this world. You know, there are people at work that if they come into the office tomorrow and they're grumpy, I'm not going to think anything's wrong. You know why? Because they're grumpy all the time. This is them. It's not like, oh man, I wonder what's wrong with so-and-so today. No, that's them. That's their personality. You see, Nehemiah comes in with a sad countenance, and the king can tell there's something wrong. This isn't like him. This isn't the same guy that I'm used to seeing. You know, people can tell when your countenance changes. So don't be nasty all the time. You know, if you're having a bad day, you know, you would hope that would show forth itself as the exception to the rule. You know, the king is inquisitive. Hey, man, what's going on? This isn't like him. If Nehemiah comes grumpy to the office every day or always wears, you know, a frown on his sleeve, that wouldn't be good. That's not a good testimony either, right? For people that are supposed to do all things without murmurings and disputings, for people that are, you know, supposed to have the joy of the Lord, a sad countenance and a grumpy spirit is just not really befitting us. So, why is thy countenance sad? I know you're not sick. This is sorrow of heart. Nehemiah, there's something bothering you. And then it says that, then I was sore afraid. He knows he can't hide it any longer. He's got to come clean about it. Now you're standing before the king. How's he going to receive this news, right? But you'll remember, he's been praying about it, hasn't he? Chapter 1 tells us that he has been praying to God. He has been praying to God to give him success and give him prosperity. He's already confessed to us. He knows that he's a royal officer. He's a cupbearer in the royal palace. And in what he is going to use, what he's going to take that job and do and pursue next, he's praying God will give him success. So when the king asks, though there's some fear, Nehemiah answers. Verse 3 says, and said unto the king, let the king live forever. Okay, that's, you know, that's still a phrase people still use in honor of majesty. Why should not my countenance be sad? When the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire. King, I got to be honest, I don't know how I can't be sad. I am sad. I don't know how I could be happy right now with the news that I got recently. Now, it's been a while, but the most recent news that he has heard is that Jerusalem is still a reproach. Jerusalem, the city walls still lie waste. And in verse number 3, when he describes it to the king, and he lets the king know what's wrong, just look at the way that he describes that. He speaks of it being not just the city of Jerusalem, but he says the place of my father's sepulchres. Like this is our homeland. This is the place that God had given us. This is where our ancestors are buried. And it's desolate. It lays waste, and the city walls are destroyed, and the gates consumed with fire. And in verse 4, the king said unto me, for what dost thou make request? What do you want? What do you need? And that is, that's telling. That's telling of the trust. That's telling of the relationship that Nehemiah had with the king. That the king can basically say, what do you need? What do you want? Now, I think we could all, imagine what it would be like to just be given a blank check, right? And you fill in the amount. Or you have anything, Aladdin gets his lamp, and he gets 3 wishes. And what do you want? And there doesn't appear to be any limits on the table. I'm reminded of 1 Kings chapter 3 when Solomon stood to become the next king of Israel. And it says in 1 Kings 3 and verse 5, in Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask what I shall give thee. And he didn't put any limitations on it. He just said, Solomon, what do you want? You're going to be king? Tell me what you want. And Solomon, as he speaks to the Lord there, he craves and he desires wisdom to lead the people, wisdom to replace his father and to be the king that Israel needs. What are the desires of our heart? What is it that if we were given a blank check would mean the most to us? What would we really want to see accomplished? What have we been praying about for months that if we had the opportunity to have success, we could pursue it and do it? And he says there in verse 4, so I prayed to the God of heaven. Nehemiah began to pray. This was the opportunity that he prayed for. He knew that God had answered his prayer in opening up the opportunity to speak to the king. And now the king has opened the door for him to ask whatever it is that has been on his mind and what has been on his heart. And as Brother John mentioned last week, and as we get into this and look, Nehemiah's first response was to pray, was to speak to the Lord. Now, it doesn't appear that he prays very long, but this opportunity has already been immersed in prayer. And in a long time, 4 months running, where Nehemiah has asked and prayed and requested and continually prayed that God give him strength and give him prosperity and success in this venture, when the king says, what do you need? What do you want? Immediately, Nehemiah goes back to the Lord. Nehemiah recognizes that this is an answer to prayer. And we're not told all of the details here that he says. We're not even told really what he prays here. But you can rest assured, based on what the Bible has told us the last 4 months have been like, you can trust that he's speaking to the Lord and thanking him for this opportunity and asking the Lord to give him wisdom in what to ask for. If he's prayed for prosperity, he's certainly got the right mindset as he returns to the Lord. So it says in verse 5, I said to the king, if it please the king, and if thy servant have found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. As a royal officer, as someone who had a position in the royal court, Nehemiah says, if it please the king, let me go. Let me go. If it please the king, if thy servant have found favor in thy sight, thou wouldest send me to Judah, the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. Nehemiah is beginning to put legs on the prayers that were prayed in chapter 1. Nehemiah is not just a doer, or not just a talker, he's a doer. He's not just a thinker. He doesn't just pray for results. As the Lord opens opportunity, Nehemiah jumps in and becomes a willing participant, a willing to work. It's easy to see what needs to be done. It's easy to get the report. Jerusalem would be in a lot better spot if those walls were rebuilt. Well, I sure hope the king lets somebody go do that. It's always easy to see what needs to be done. But when you look at someone like Nehemiah, you see both. You see wisdom and insight, that Judah has become a reproach and they're defenseless and they need help. And then on the other hand, you see the willingness to be part of the answer, a willingness to get involved, to be engaged, and to do the work himself. Again, notice what he calls the city. You can tell that it's important to him. It's his family's home. It's where he comes from. Now, he hasn't been there personally. Nehemiah is not old enough to have been taken away in the captivity. But this is the land of his ancestors. These are his people. And they're a reproach. And he wants to personally be involved. Okay? That's a challenge. That's a challenge to each of us, right? It's easy in chapter 1 to see what needs to be done. It takes effort to personally want to step up and get involved in what needs to be done. Okay? Don't just be someone that points out what needs fixed, right? Help fix it. And that appears to be the kind of guy that Nehemiah is. Now, Nehemiah had obviously found favor with the king, because the king's response in verse 6 is, "And the king said unto me, the queen also sitting by him, For how long shall thy journey be? And when wilt thou return?" How long are you going to be gone? When can you get back? And it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Nehemiah makes his plan and gets approval from the king. And then in verse 7 it says, "Moreover I sent unto the king, or said unto the king, If it please the king, let letters be given me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over till I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace which appertain to the house, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall enter into. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Then I came to the governors beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters, and the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me." Now letters were sent, and you read verse 7, 8, and 9, and you realize that not only has Nehemiah been praying about this, Nehemiah has been thinking about this. This is well thought out. He realizes and he knows that, well, I got the king's approval. He doesn't just kind of fly by the seat of his pants. He's thought about this. I'm going to need, not only am I just not going to need approval from the king, I'm going to need letters, because as I travel, as I make this journey, those that I approach, those lands that I come through, I'm going to need to show them the authority of the king. And I don't know exactly what I'm going to see when I get there, but I know I'm going to need some supplies. And king, if you could send letters that I could go to those that are in charge of the forest and the timbers, I know I'm going to need those supplies when I get there. So king, if you could sign, if you could sign here and give me approval to take that which I'm going to need when I get there. This is well thought out, and he had prayed much about it, and that's a challenge to us. It's encouraging. It's helpful to us that we enter with prayers and with plans. We don't want to be unbalanced. We don't want to just jump in head first with no plans, no prayer. But we also don't want to pray and then not put forth any effort, right? We want to do both. We want to pray that God will open up opportunities for us to serve, pray that God will give us a vision and wisdom to see what needs to be done, and then that as God opens those opportunities, that we'll act and that we'll engage, and that we will try to formulate well thought out plans, that we will try to make wise use of the time and the opportunities that are given. We trust God and we work. Okay? Nehemiah is not trusting God to fix the problem. He's trusting that God will use him in this problem, right? It's not just that he's prayed that God will fix it and I hope that works out. No, he's praying that God will fix it, and then I want the opportunity to be part of that. Okay? So that takes us to the end of verse 9. Nehemiah has approval. He has letters from the king. He has permission that he can go back and that he can rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Now, number 2, I'm going to pause there and tell you that this is a very important historical event. You say, the building of the city walls is an important event. No. I'm telling you that Nehemiah getting permission to go and rebuild the city walls is an important event. Let's turn to Daniel chapter 9. When Nehemiah requested letters and permission to rebuild the city, something interesting happened. A prophecy was fulfilled. And Daniel chapter 9 tells us that a timeline was started. Now, Daniel chapter 9, and of course, Daniel prophesied during the time of the Babylonian captivity. He was one that had been taken captive. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, It says 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and to build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again and the wall, even in troublous times. Now, Daniel chapter 9, of course, is the famous prophecy of the 70 weeks. And Daniel tells us that the first 69 weeks, or the first 69 sevens, are intended to bring Messiah the Prince. Daniel foretold of when Messiah the Prince would come. It would be, according to verse 25 here, 69 sevens, 7 plus 62, that's 69 weeks or periods of 7, until Messiah the Prince come. You say, well, but when does that start? He tells us when it starts. From the going forth of the command to rebuild Jerusalem. Do you know when that happens? Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah chapter 2, which takes place around 445 BC, when Nehemiah receives approval and receives letters from the king to go back and to restore and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, it's like a clock started ticking. And from that moment on, that started a clock ticking that would bring Messiah the Prince into this world. The Messiah was going to come into this world, of course, but now, from the days of Nehemiah, you can actually set a calendar to it. Did you guys know that? Did you guys know that from the time Nehemiah received this command, that started a clock ticking, and now you can set a calendar to when Messiah, the Prince, would come? When you read in the New Testament and when Jesus Christ came, it really should not be a wonder or a surprise to us that there was a lot of messianic expectation among the people. People that were aware of these prophecies, people that were aware of their history would know this is kind of the time. This is the time when Messiah the Prince could or should be expected. And so don't want to pass that over, that in Nehemiah chapter 2, a clock starts ticking, because what Daniel had prophesied earlier during the captivity has now happened. The command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem has happened. And so starts a clock that will inevitably end with the bringing in of Messiah the Prince. All right, Nehemiah chapter 2. You wouldn't necessarily get all of that just reading the historical events in the book of Nehemiah, but coupled with the prophecy that Daniel gave and how the timeline works out, Messiah the Prince was going to be coming. Now, every good adventure, every good story, every good tale has what? Has good guys and bad guys, right? Well, that's our third thought. Look here in verse number 10. This story is going to have some villains. Everything's been fun, right, and exciting so far. Nehemiah, he sees what needs to be done. He prays about what needs to be done. He gets permission to go and do what needs to be done. Everything's all exciting. He's got it well thought out and well prayed over. He's got plans. He's got letters of permission. He's got approval. Everything seems to be working out perfectly. And then verse 10 tells us that when Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. Here we're introduced to some villains for our story. Every good story needs bad guys, right? Now, you don't get all the details yet. You're just kind of introduced to them here in this verse. But you'll get more as you roll through this book. Notice what grieved them. What made Sanballat and Tobiah? Well, let's ask this. What made Nehemiah grieved? Nehemiah was grieved for his people. Nehemiah was grieved that they were a reproach. He was grieved that they had no defense. He was grieved that they had no help and lived in worry and in fear. What grieved Sanballat and Tobiah? It grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. They got upset and they got grieved and they got agitated when someone else cared. They didn't care when Jerusalem was weak, and they didn't care when Jerusalem was vulnerable. They didn't care when the people weren't strong or weren't secure. But now that someone else has shown interest, and now that someone else has shown care, now they're upset. Now they're grieved. Don't be that guy, right? Don't be the person that gets upset when other people care and other people want to make efforts to help and to fix things. Isn't it weird that people can be like that? Isn't it weird that there's those kind of people that they can see all the terrible, all the trouble, all the worry, all the things that are going on, and it doesn't bother them. But you get somebody that gets excited and prayerful and helpful and concerned, and then they get mad. Don't be that kind of person. Sanballat and Tobiah are those kind of guys. They don't want to see anyone care. Now Nehemiah arrives. And in verse 11 it says, "So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And I arose in the night, I and some few men with me. And neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. Neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon." So he's got a plan. He comes into Jerusalem and he doesn't broadcast anything. He keeps things quiet. He's going to observe. He's going to assess the situation. Look here in verse 13. "So I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, and to the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire. I went on to the gate of the fountain, and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass." Can you imagine the rubble being so stacked on one side of the city that he couldn't even get his animal to cross through it? I mean, just terrible. These walls were completely broken down and destroyed. His own beast couldn't pass. And then in verse 15, "Went I up in the night by the brook and viewed the wall, and turned back and entered by the gate of the valley, and so returned. And the rulers knew not whither I went or what I did. Neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work." So in secret and in quiet, he comes with his plan, and he begins to assess the situation. And listen, I'm sure that he cried many tears as he went around the city. You can imagine seeing the rubble that he did. He probably began to relive the events that are told in 2 Kings 25 and that Jeremiah wrote about in Jeremiah chapter 52. You can read all of those things. And as he began to look at the rubble, he probably begins to reimagine in his mind what happened. And, you can, it's hard for us to kind of imagine anything really similar. One of the only things I really remember from my lifetime is, pictures and videos that people would show about 9/11, right after the towers had come down, and then they would just show, you could just see the rubble and the debris, and you couldn't make anything out, and that was all that it was. It was just a bunch of concrete and steel mess stacked up on each other. And Nehemiah went around and saw an entire gate surrounding of a city that was in that shape. But he's assessed the situation, he's got his plan, and he knows what he needs to do. So verse 17, "I said unto them, Ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Come on, guys, let's get to work. We've been a reproach for too long. Let's get to work. Let's rebuild these walls. Let's put an end to this. Our people need safety. Our people need defenses. Our people are living in fear all the time. Let's get to work and build these walls. And it's an encouragement to hear verse 18, because he says, Then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. And they said, Let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. You know, Nehemiah was able to tell them of God's working in getting to this point. Like, right, this Nehemiah showing up on the scene is not where this story begins. Nehemiah is able to tell them how God has worked. You know, God has put this on my mind. God opened the opportunity to talk to the king. God softened the king's heart. God allowed the king to send letters with permission and approval and supplies. Before these men are ever contacted, they're able to hear about what God has already done in starting this process. You know, that's an encouragement to get to work when you can look at your situation, when you can look at the project that lies before you, and you can see, you know what? There's a lot of things that have already gone right. There's a lot of things, there's a lot that God has already done to make this plan and this project possible. And that gets people excited, right? That gets people encouraged to know that God's probably in this. God has already shown that he is in this. These aren't just guys that are going to pick up hammers and get to work without any thought or any encouragement. No, God has already evidently shown he's in this plan. And that helps. And so it says that they strengthened their hands for this good work. All right, let's close out the chapter. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant the Ammonite and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, What is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king? Now, when you do step out by faith and you try to work hard and serve the Lord, unfortunately, you'd have to deal at times with ridicule. Sanballat and Tobiah, they come and they laugh. And as men tried to you can just imagine, right, that as they try to lift rubble out of the way and as they try to, pry and loosen these tons and tons of stone that were just heaped upon heaps of rubble on each other. What are you guys doing? Come on, you're never going to make this work. Are you kidding me? Look, there's not even that many of you. And they're ignorant. These men are ignorant, right? Because when they say in verse number 19, what is this thing that you do? Will ye rebel against the king? Pretty sure the king had already sent them with permission. And you know what? A lot of people that ridicule are ignorant. People that ridicule, people that are working hard, and people that are evidently and obviously working under God's hand and God's providence. People that ridicule that, these guys could not be more wrong. These guys could not be more wrong spiritually. They could not be more wrong factually about the state of the situation. You guys going to be rebellious against the king and rebuild this city? Well, guess what this letter says, right? This is approval. This is permission to do so. Don't let ridicule. And I don't care if it comes from unbelievers, if it comes from believers that are lazy, if it comes from people that are just of a critical spirit, don't let ridicule keep us from just faithfully pursuing a good work, from trying to serve, from trying to be faithful. Don't let ridicule, this laughing to scorn, and this despise, don't let those things slow you down. Don't let those things be a hindrance. Okay? Then answered I them and said unto them, The God of heaven, he will prosper us. That's what you need. You need confidence in the Lord, confidence that God is working with us and for us. Therefore we, his servants, will arise and build, but ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. Nehemiah now is using a little bit more forceful language, and he recognizes, you know what, God is in this, and we're working hard, and he is going to prosper us. And when this is all said and done, guess what? You're not going to have any part of it. You know, you're not with us. Obviously, you can look at their heritage, and you can tell that they're not of the same ancestry and type of folks that Nehemiah and his company were. But Nehemiah takes the ridicule that is aimed his way, and he speaks his confidence is in God. And he has absolute confidence that they will finish this job. And he's already talking about when this job is done, you're not going to have any part in it. You won't have any part. Ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. So chapter 2 kind of lays out the overall scheme, the overall game plan, right? Nehemiah has revealed what he's been praying about all these months. He wants to go back. He wants to lead a journey of men back. He wants to take some of the remnant that is there in Judah and rebuild these walls. And chapter 2 introduces us to some characters, the men that are going to build with him, the men that are going to oppose him. And we've kind of already established part of the conflict that's going to rise in this book. They have a lot of work ahead of them. This is a big task. Nehemiah has circled the city and assessed the situation. The walls are broken down everywhere. Some places so bad that his own animal can't pass through. But he's determined, and though he's going to have opposition, he's focused. He has a plan, and his trust is in God to help him accomplish it. Okay? It's going to be a good story. Father, we come tonight, and we're grateful to be here. Thankful for our church.